especially the holy fools. Because the holy fools will always be doing silly things.
It's funny you say that because I just picked up a book on the sayings of the Desert Fathers.
Such a great book.
And you read some of it, you're like, this just sounds like a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Like throwing somebody into an oven and the oven becomes a fridge or something cold. Or
yeah, and there's dragons and all kinds of interesting animal stories and stuff. Yeah. The proper way to look at that, I think, is that, and this is not an original thought to me. This is something that's been talked about from age immemorial. But when you go away from the center being civilization, Camelot, the city, and you move to the fringes, to the margins, that's where the chaos is. That's where the wildness is. That's where the potential is. So you encounter things there that don't make sense. You encounter things there that are shape-shifting, are demonic, are strange, and you have to have the proper posture to them. And in the lives of the saints, in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, that's a very clear thing. They go out there to battle. They go out there to go into their inner self and then fight all the things that happen to them. So those sayings are incredible. Sayings of the Desert Fathers, and there's another one. I'm not sure if the Mosaic history, that one is just wild. Same kind of
So what would you
tradition.
say to someone like me who's reading this for like inspiration to grow closer to our Lord?
Yeah.
And I come across these stories, I'm like, well, this is obviously like this clearly didn't happen. Do you see?
Yeah.
How should one read them then? Because
this is a really important topic. I'm glad we're talking about this. And so let's go at it this way. First off, I think that it's very useful when you're approaching these stories to have the posture of humility of the idiot. So when you're approaching these stories,
you're there as a student.
Yes, I think it's very useful to just say, what if this could happen? Just allow that as a possibility. And I'll explain why in a second. Unfortunately, this is not something that comes easy to the 21st century modern person, not least because there is a tradition in both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches to discredit certain types of saint stories as clear fabrications. There was a encyclopedic effort to separate the wheat from the chaff in the Catholic Church that began in the 16th century and culminated in the 20th. So you have the lives of the saints, and they've been properly. I forgot the names of the. Do you remember?
Are you talking about the collection, the Butler's Lives of the Saints?
Perhaps? No, not those. This is something else. I don't remember, and I should have checked before I came here because I knew we were going to talk about this. So shame on me, but perhaps we can put it in the show notes later if I remember. But anyway, there was a concerted effort to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff and kind of show these are the real ones, these are the not so real ones. And there's there's some value to that because it's clear that in the medieval storytelling tradition, there are some stories that are very clearly Christian legends that are not lives of saints. There's a wonderful example of this in the Russian tradition. So the patron saints, if you will, although Orthodox don't like to use that terminology because they see it as limiting, but let's just use it for the sake of argument. The patron saints of marriage in the Russian Orthodox setting are a prince and his wife from the 11th century, I believe, possibly later. Oh gosh, what are their names? This is embarrassing.
It's good for us.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I will remember at a very inopportune moment.
Inopportune time. Yes. We're back to talking about the war, and you're going to say...
I have silly old Russian names in my head that don't have anything to do with the story, which is very embarrassing. Oh, yeah. All right,
Peter and Fervrona.
Yes, Saints Peter and Fervrona.
Catholic Jamie, everybody.
All right, here we go.
To give Catholic Jamie a raise, click that thumbs up button. If we get 8 million thumbs up, I'll give him $20.
Hey,
more.
Almost there.
I don't know.
Saints Peter and Fervrona. They were an actual couple, lived, we know that for a fact. Husband and wife, married.
Yep.
Eventually became monks and nuns, like agreed to separate towards the end of their lives. And there's a wonderful, verifiable story that is part of the official lives where they were separately. They died on the same day, first of all, or like one day after the other, something like that. And they were separately buried because it was inappropriate for a monk to be buried with a nun. And they would leave them in their coffins, and the next day one of the coffins was empty and they were together in the other one. And this happened several times. So finally they just let it go and they buried them together. And now their relics are incorrupt, and you can actually see them in the city of Murom in the north of Russia. But there is a tale of Saints Peter and Fervrona that is clearly a fairy tale, because there is a serpent tempter, a shapeshifter, who takes the form of the brother of Saint Peter, who is the head prince, and he seduces one of the local princesses, and Saint Peter comes to fight him, and in the process, and by the way, he gets a magic sword to do this, of course, because that's what you do. You go to the mountains and you get magic swords. That's absolutely, you have to do that. So he goes and he fights the shapeshifter demon, and he gets the demon apparently has a capillaries and blood, because he chops his head off, the blood spurts on him, and he has these huge incurable sores. Basically leprosy. There's nothing you can do about it. None of the doctors are able to help. It's a demonic affliction, right? So he finds out about this village healer who's named Fervrona, and she lives by herself in a small village, basically doesn't do anything. He goes there and he asks her for healing, and she says, well, you have to marry me. That's how it's going to work. And this part of it actually is probably true. She probably was a village healer.
Given his incurable sores, he's like, I got to settle for whoever'll have me.
Yeah, that's what he did. He said, I agree. Okay. And now we're back to the legend part, not the actual life part, which gets confusing to untangle sometimes. But in the official life, he agrees to become her husband, and she heals him. Then he breaks his word, and he gets sick again. And after that, he understands it's God's. So that's the official version. In the legend, she purposely leaves a sore on him because she knows that he's going to. Yeah. So that detail is too salacious to be included in the saint's life. So we put that into the legends, right? Yeah. So and then she demonstrates her power by doing things like touching trees, and they grow in a single second. And there's all kinds of other insane things. So the basic bare bones of the historical life of these saints is there, but then it's elaborated. So that's a medieval legend.
It's important, you said, in one sense, to be able to
distinguish those, because it's clear that some stories are legends that were just told around the fire as a kind of part of the storytelling fairy tale tradition that just included elements of the now accepted Christian culture, right? But there also are lives of the saints that have a lot of very strange things happening in them, but that do not belong to the oral storytelling tradition. Very clearly don't belong to the tradition that has elaborated on the existing officially accepted lives of the saints. You especially see these in the collected lives of monastic saints from the Kiev Caves, Lavra, from Saint Holy Trinity, Saint Sergius Lavra outside of Moscow. And you see it all the way back to the lives of the desert saints. There is a category of life of saint where there are things that are clearly miraculous and involve very strange interactions with beasts. Sometimes there are dragons, and it's unclear whether the dragon is just an animal that has been mislabeled or it's a demonic apparition. There was a very concerted effort, like I said, both in the Catholic and the Orthodox, but especially the Catholic tradition, to really keep these separate. And anything that smacked of fairy tale tradition, get rid of it. It can't possibly be real, by virtue of having those elements that you sometimes see in the legends, in prehistorical mythology also. Because you see things like idols toppling when martyrs walk into a church, right? And this is a repeated trope. Or an ascetic saint not taking his mother's milk on Wednesday and Friday, right? Or manifestations of power that directly mimic stories of the Greek heroes and gods. So a certain kind of mindset will say, look at the parallels. Clearly, the writers of the stories, the writers of the lives, were using the models that came before and are making a point about the victory of Christianity. And so you can take these, you can read them, they're edifying, but don't think of them as real. But that's not the way that the medieval and the ancient mind actually accepted these things. And if you're looking at an authentic reception of these lives, you have to just be honest about the fact that there has never been a shift, really, not officially, in the way that we look at these. Certainly, or no official proclamation from either Pope or anybody to make these things somehow invalid. And it's I believe that they absolutely did happen. All of those stories, the ones that sound like the tales of the heroes, and for one specific reason. Tolkien talks about this in on fairy stories. Christ coming into Earth the way he did mimics the heroic pattern of certain kind of mythological, in fact, all basically mythological structures. All right. It was myth coming into history. That's the way Tolkien and Lewis talked about it. That's how Lewis eventually converted, right? But there was a template that was provided there. Christ entered into a story and embodied the story that had been told before him by many different traditions, by many different peoples. So then what happened was that the saints ended up doing a similar thing, embodying the tropes and the patterns of storytelling in actual historical fact. So the things that happened to them happened for a reason, not because some scribe decided that they should demonstrate the power of Christianity over paganism, but because Christianity was a power over paganism. And so the way that these things were manifested naturally echoed the stories that were told, because that's how God showed the people there that this is the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that is the most authentic, the most realistic way of approaching it. It's also very difficult. If you don't mind, I can expand on this a little bit. It requires a completely different way of looking at the life of a saint, not as a historical account at all, not as something that is historical in the sense of 19th, 20th, 21st century historiography, where you're looking at extant artifacts, looking at things that were written about a person and being able to verify from the given evidence about the existence of this, that, or the other. Yeah?
Okay, yeah.
That's not how the church looks at its storytelling tradition, at the lives of the saints. It looks at the lives of saints as an embodying of the tropes that were given in the fairy tale tradition before the coming of Christ, because fairy tales are very old. They go way back, thousands of years. So there's something prophetic in the way that people told these fairy tales. There's something about those repeated tropes, the repeated patterns that the stories all have. Oftentimes there are repeated patterns in different parts of the world. That's not to say that there aren't different storytelling traditions with their own particular affects. Absolutely, that is the case. But you still see certain patterns in all storytelling traditions that point to the coming of Christ. That's just simple fact. So when then the saints have their lives written down by people sometimes who lived 3, 4, 5, 600 years after those saints died, the writers of those lives, they don't go looking for the archival tradition. They don't go looking for appearances of these saints in some manuscript in some dusty library.
That's right.
They treat it as an icon. So the icon has tropes. When you draw an icon of a certain kind of saint, you're going to follow a certain kind of pattern. Why? Because that pattern reflects the reality of that saint's life. So if you're an ascetic, you're going to have a long beard, you're going to have a very narrow face, you're going to have a certain kind of way of dressing, right? St. Peter always has a short beard. These are things that become part of the tradition of iconography that has nothing to do with a historical archival tradition as we would understand it in the 19th, 20th century sense, right?
Yep.
So then what ends up happening is the writer of a life looks at existing commonalities and tropes and infuses them into what he already knows about the life of the saint, even if those things are not verifiable historically. So let's give a historical example. For a medieval mind, for a medieval writer of a saint life, for example, there's two ascetic saints named Saint Kirill who lived in Russia. One was in like the 14th, the other one was in the 17th century. This is a point, by the way, made by the wonderful novelist Eugene Vodolazkin in an article in First Things, which is called The Age of Concentration, I think. It's a wonderful article. Highly recommend it. Where he talks about how their two lives of the two Saint Cyrils who lived 300 years apart have almost exactly the same rhythms. The lives look almost identical. When you show that to a 21st century person, it says, oh, well, clearly the 17th century writer looked at the model of the 14th century and copied it. But a medieval person, when seeing these two and asked, why are these saints' lives the same? Their answer would have been something like, well, of course they're the same. They're both named Saint Kirill. So it's a totally different way of relating to it. Since they're named Kirill, there's something ineffable about the choosing of that name, and that name is a pattern and it reflects a certain kind of storytelling that is then reflected in actual real life. So it doesn't even matter if you don't have archival information about the details of that person's life. You prayerfully approach the writing of the saint's life with the models of the previous saints, and then you just go from there. So if I can go even further, I'm really hogging it, I'm sorry. But
no, I'm enjoying it.
So I teach at an Orthodox seminary.
Okay.
Young men coming through this very rationalistic tradition, many of whom are priest children, doesn't matter. You're still imbibing the spirit of the Enlightenment with your mother's milk. There's nothing you can do about it. So this St. John that I mentioned earlier, whose relics repose in the San Francisco Cathedral, he was a saint who lived in the first half of the 20th century, St. John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco. An incredible ascetic, hardly slept ever, constant man of constant prayer, and also a man of incredible love, who was constantly doing acts of mercy. He would walk around every night. He would go to the local hospital and just minister to people. It didn't matter if they were Orthodox or not. That was his everyday life. He would pick orphans up from China when he was a bishop there, because girl children were often thrown out into the streets to die. He would pick them up, take them, build an orphanage. Some of those people are still alive in San Francisco today. There is a story about him that he walked around barefoot all the time. The reason being that he always gave away his shoes. So my mother knew him personally, and as far as she can tell from talking to people that knew him very intimately, he never really did that, historically speaking, right? He did walk around in sandals, and sometimes he took them off because his feet would hurt. He was always on them standing and praying. And sometimes he would hand them to people who had no shoes on their feet. But it wasn't something that he constantly did, right? So a lot of the apocryphal stories, especially if you read some of the children's lives of the children's lives of saints version of his life, it makes it sound like he always walked around barefoot, sort of like St. Francis, right? Which was probably not the case, historically speaking. Now, I gave my students a thought experiment. I said, look, you're going to get into a blue police box that's bigger on the inside, all right? And you're going to fly 300 years into the future, and you're going to open the door, and out you come into this Jordanville 300 years in the future, and you're going to look at the received official life of St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco. I'm telling you right now, you will probably see in the official received life the detail about him walking around barefoot. And they were like, no, we know the history. It's not going to happen. And I said to them, guys, that's not the point, because that detail is hagiographical. It might not reflect an precise historical reality, but it reflects the absolute reality of who that person was. And he probably did it once or twice, so you can say that he did it. But to make this big deal out of it, like he always walked around barefoot, that's mythic consciousness. That's hagiographical consciousness. It's a different way of relating to the saints, because the saints are greater than we are.
So I got two sort of, I don't know if they're objections, but sort of two ways of pushing back against that. The two concerns I have with documenting the saints' lives in a way that did not actually happen. That's one thing if you're going to talk about shoes. It's another thing if you're going to say she was then buried by a lion or something even more seemingly incredible.
Right.
The two issues I see with that is if you have things that actually didn't happen mixed with things that actually did and are just as seemingly incredible, you will be tempted to throw out what actually happened. Okay. Yeah. The second thing I see.
Can we address that? Can you put a pin in the second one, just so I don't lose my track of thought? So in the thought experiment that I gave him, I postulated that the historical record was hazy on the details of whether or not he actually gave away these shoes. You, as a person who lived closer to him in history, having traveled in time 200 years, know for a fact, right? But it shouldn't bother you that the received tradition, meaning the information that we actually got, we don't have any information to the contrary, is my point, right? It's not like there's a manuscript tradition that says he never took his shoes off, right? It's that there is a consciousness.
But there might be. I mean, one of your mother's friends may write that down.
Maybe. But let's say that there isn't.
Okay.
All right? Because I think if that were the case, then probably it wouldn't be received into the...
Okay, fair enough. Yep.
But I think that the more important thing is that there is a kind of supra-historical consciousness about the saints that allows for not ahistorical material, but material that is beyond history because it reflects the deeper reality of who they are. So,
sure.
As an example, there is a saint who lived in the 2nd century. His name is Saint Averkius in Russian. We know nothing at all about him, except that there is a stela that was discovered several hundred years after his death that has a few things written about something having to do with him being a bishop in this or that city. In spite of that, the church officially, this is 4th or 5th century, so there's no divisions, nothing. This is the church, right? Commissioned a life. And the life is very elaborate. He goes and he casts out serpents from a statue. He gets tortured in elaborate ways. These are things that are not found in anywhere. And yet they make their way into the life, and they are accepted by the church as the life as received within the church. It's like an icon of what this saint could have been and was, because this is how we received it. So I think there's a level of trust that the person who writes down the life is given a responsibility that is a very serious one, just as the iconographer is given a very serious responsibility. When he approaches this task, and when he doesn't have the necessary information, he works within an existing pattern, an existing system, to make sure that what he passes on will say everything that it can about that saint, but in a way that can be edifying for us who listen to his life. Because it was clear that he was somebody who triumphed over paganism, so they kind of...
I'm thinking of St. Patrick would be another example of casting the apparent saints out of Ireland.
Absolutely. No, the whole tradition of St. Patrick stories is very interesting. I'm not an expert, but I will tell you that the reception of the St. Patrick legends right now amongst people who are coming back to Christianity is not one of skepticism. It's one of great joy. People love to read stories that involve weird manifestations of animal activity, that involve kind of bizarre ahistorical. They love that stuff because to them it speaks of a reality of the inhabiting of God on earth that isn't limited by historical contingency, but that points to something greater. And that's something that people really want to reach towards. They can read their history books whenever they want, but in their lives of saints, they want to have inklings of something greater than simply the hard facts and realities of history.
Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Would you like this beautiful, very high quality, definitely not made in China, not that there's anything wrong with that, Pints with Aquinas beer stein for free, sent to your door? Would you also like a copy of The Jill sent to your door 4 times a year? This is the Pints with Aquinas newspaper, by the way. If you do, go to mattfradd.locals.com and become an annual supporter for any amount. We'll send you that stuff for free, and you get a bunch of other free things in return. You'll get more information by going over to mattfradd.locals.com. Thanks.